The first permanent English settlement in the United States was Jamestown. And today we're going to talk about Jamestown. I am going to talk about 12 years that were very important to Jamestown. It's going to be like a year here and a year here and a year here. But I'm talking about 12 years in Jamestown that really made Jamestown what it became and then what it is today. So I'm not going to talk about the whole history of Jamestown. That would take me hours and hours to do. I'm just going to specifically hit on 12 specific years in the history of Jamestown. So let's get started. So the first year on my timeline is going to be the year 1606. So 1606 is when a charter was granted to the Virginia Company from King James I to establish a colony in Virginia. So in December of 1606, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery would set sail out of England, bound for Virginia. The Virginia Company was a group of investors who hoped to profit from this new venture. They were hoping that these settlers would come over to the New World, set up a colony, be able to get things that they would be able to bring back to England to sell to make money. So when King James I granted the charter in 1606, he had goals that he wanted this charter, this expansion, this voyage to meet. And those were counterbalancing the expansion of the European nations abroad, seeking a northwest passage to the Orient, and converting Virginia Indians to the Anglican religion. So those were like when King James I signed this charter, he said, these are things I want you to do. So the next year on the timeline is going to be the very next year, 1607. So the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery would explore the West Indies and the Chesapeake Bay before making their way to the area of Jamestown. So in May of 1607, Captain Christopher Newport would settle on Jamestown Island to be the settlement spot where this new colony would be created. This would actually happen 13 years before the Pilgrims would arrive at Plymouth in Massachusetts. So why did Captain Christopher Newport pick Jamestown? So it was actually called Jamestown Island back then because it was surrounded by water on three sides. It was not completely surrounded yet, but it would be later on. And it was easily defensible. They felt like that they were worried about the Spanish coming in and seeing them. So it was kind of back off the ocean. So they felt like they kind of could be hidden. And it was a spot that the native population was not currently inhabiting. So that is why Captain Christopher Newport chose Jamestown Island to be the spot of the new colony. So once they got to the island, 104 men and boys would embark on this new adventure. So the initial group of settlers contained well-to-do adventurers, a handful of artisans and craftsmen, and some laborers. And these people were really eager to forge this new home. One thing you will see that was not on these ships were women. And women would not come to the island for about another 9 months. Once on the island in 1607, they had to get some form of government. So they would actually have what was called a council of 7, and one member would serve as the president, making a bulk of the decisions. The next year on my timeline is going to be the year 1608. By 1608, by January, only 38 of the original 104 settlers were still alive. So it is documented that many died from disease and famine. Some did die from skirmishes with the native tribes that were in the area, but most of them died from disease and famine. And one of the things that's been talked about a lot as to why so many died was because of toxic water. So there have been wells found at the current Jamestown site that have been, the water's been sampled, and they found high concentrations of salt, arsenic, contamination from fecal matter. And this could have played into why so many people died, because they didn't have clean water. So in September of 1608, Captain John Smith would take over, and he was going to implement and impose this new discipline to get everybody in line and working together. So he will say, and I quote, "He that will not work shall not eat, except by sickness he be disabled." Pretty much saying, if you're not working to contribute, you're not gonna eat unless you are sick. It is said that during Smith's administration, no settlers would die of starvation, and the colony survived the winter with very minimal loss. A couple weeks after Smith took over in late September of 1608, the first ship would arrive that would have women on it, and that first woman would be Mistress Forrest. The next year on my timeline is going to be the year 1610. So I talked about how Captain Smith led the colony to be prospering, people weren't dying, but Smith would be injured in the fall of 1609 and would actually leave Jamestown to go back to England. So for a time, there really wasn't a main person in charge, and this is going to be detrimental to Jamestown. So after Smith would leave, that winter of 1609 into early 1610 would be known as the Starving Time. So during the Starving Time, the English were afraid to leave the fort due to concern about being killed by the local native tribes, the Powhatan Indians. As a result of this, they ate whatever they could. They ate various animals, leather from their shoes and their belts, and sometimes even fellow settlers who had passed away. So in early 1610, Sir Thomas Gates would be the newly named governor, and when he got there, he found Jamestown in a shambles. And he realized that food was running low, forts were being torn down. Gates that were supposed to protect them were hanging off their hinges, and he made the decision to abandon Jamestown. So they would get on their boats, they would leave Jamestown, sail down the river, and less than a day after leaving, hope would arrive. So that hope would be because of a man named Lord Delaware. He would arrive with 3 ships, 150 settlers, and supplies that were muchly needed. So Lord Delaware is not someone a lot of people have really heard of if you haven't done the research. I know about Lord Delaware not only from research, but because he is my husband's 12th great-grandfather. So when Lord Delaware arrived, he would work to build 2 new forts near the mouth of the James River. He would help rebuild Jamestown, and he would really be what brought order to all the chaos that was going on during this time. So who is Lord Delaware? So Lord Delaware's real name is Thomas West, Baron de la Ware. And so he would end up being governor of Virginia from June of 1610 through March of 1611, but he would hold the title of governor through June 7th of 1618, mainly represented by deputies because he wasn't there. He would become ill in March of 1611, and he would return to England. He would attempt to return back to Virginia in 1618, but he would die on the way. So, in 1610, Lord Delaware showing up with reinforcements and supplies is what saved Jamestown. The next year on my timeline is going to be the year 1612. So why 1612? Well, in 1610, John Roth would arrive at Jamestown with new settlers, and he brought with him tobacco seeds from South America. So there was some initial trial and error with trying to cultivate these tobacco seeds, but by 1612, they turned into a major cash crop and really stabilized the Jamestown economy. The next year on my timeline is going to be the year 1619. John Roth would document the first arrival of Africans to Jamestown in late 1619. So where did these Africans come from? So the Africans on the ship that arrived in 1619 were captured in modern-day Angola on the west coast of Africa. And they were on a Portuguese ship destined for Mexico. So while in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 English privateers would attack the ship, and they would take 50 to 60 of the African captives on board. This is how the first Africans ended up in Jamestown. So while these Africans were unfree, the practice of enslaving Africans for life occurred more regularly after the mid-century, replacing indentured servants with this primary source of labor. Next spot on my timeline is the year 1620. What happened in the year 1620? Well, 100 women would arrive to Jamestown to be brides for the settlers. So women back in England had heard horror stories about the conditions at Jamestown, and they weren't really jumping at the opportunity to get on a boat, sail across the ocean, and go live in this place that they keep hearing all these terrible things about. So to get these women to agree to go to Jamestown, they were offered incentives, and some of these incentives included free transportation, a plot of land, a clothing allowance, and furnishings for their home. They also said the women would be able to choose their own husbands and the husbands would not be chosen for them. So this tactic had some success, and these first 100 women would be America's first kind of like mail order brides. So the next date on my timeline is going to be the specific date of March 22nd, 1622. And this is because there's going to be an attack on Jamestown. Now, there had been multiple skirmishes and attacks on Jamestown, but this is going to be a pretty big one. So Native American leader Opie Kankanu, which I hope I'm saying is the name right, carried out a surprise attack on the colonists on the morning of March 22nd of 1622. This attack was the strongest attack that they'd ever had at Jamestown. The settlement would receive warnings near minutes before the attack started, and they were able to mount a little bit of a defense. Somewhere between about 350 and 400 colonists would die during this attack. The reports vary, but the death toll would represent about 1/4 to 1/3 of Jamestown's entire population. The next date on my timeline is we're going all the way to the year 1676. And why? Because of Bacon's Rebellion. So I talk about Bacon's Rebellion in my class, and my kids love the story, and they love how his last name was Bacon. So in 1676, Jamestown was pretty much burned completely to the ground in this rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion. What happened? So this is where Virginia's government was. Like, this is where all the important people were. And this rebellion was led by a man named Nathaniel Bacon against colonial governor William Berkeley. Why? Berkeley had refused Bacon's request to get help to drive the Native Americans out of Virginia. Bacon said that they were getting attacked, they needed support, and Governor Berkeley said, "No, we're not helping you, you're on your own." What does Bacon do? He gets a group of people together, and they attack Jamestown and pretty much burn the city to the ground. Bacon's Rebellion would be known as the first rebellion in the North American colonies. The next point on the timeline, we're moving to 1699. So after Bacon's Rebellion, they would rebuild Jamestown, and then they would end up moving Virginia's capital from Jamestown to Williamsburg, and people would slowly move away from Jamestown to Williamsburg following the move of the capital. Next point on my timeline is the year 1892. By 1892, there was no one living on Jamestown Island, and the island would be purchased by Mr. and Miss Edward Barney. So Mr. and Miss Barney would really start kind of this thought of preservation of Jamestown, and they would grant Jamestown's churchyard to the preservation organization APVA, which stands for the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. And this would really start the preservation process. It would take off a little bit, and then it would slow down and would not take off again until the 90s. So the last year on my timeline is going to be 1994. So in 1994, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project would begin by the APVA, which resulted in the excavation and study of the original 1607 James Fort. So what is Jamestown today? So because of the excavation that really started in 1994, Jamestown has grown to this historical site. They have found parts of old palisades from the original 1607 fort. They've discovered a site of a second church, and they have unearthed remains of a handful of settlers. They've debunked myths about Jamestown sites. They've learned new information. They've found artifacts and weapons and pottery. They uncovered evidence from the starving time and the cannibalism, and learned more about how the settlers lived their everyday lives and what their work habits were. You can go visit Jamestown. Me and my family went last year, and it was wonderful. I hadn't been to Jamestown in probably 20 years. And so you can go visit, you can walk around Jamestown, you can see the sites. They have exhibits, they've got museums on site. They have recreations of the three ships, the Susan Constant, the Discovery, and the Godspeed, that you can get on and see like how they were small, like how small these ships really are in comparison to how many people were on them. You can go into the exhibits, and they have films describing the culture of not only the settlers, but of the native tribes who were there. So, if you have never been to Jamestown, I really advise you going. I think it's a great historical opportunity. It's part of the historical triangle, which includes Williamsburg and Yorktown, which I will talk about in later videos. But you should really go visit Jamestown. It is a monumental part of American history. If you enjoyed today's video and you would like to see more videos like this one, please like, subscribe, and comment below with something that you learned today.